Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the civil conflict that leads, which is going to serve as your worked practice overview. Basically, we're putting on our historical investigator hats to focus on a truly critical period in U.S. history, the American Civil War. But, we aren't just going to sit here and memorize dates. Instead, we're going to look directly at the primary and secondary sources provided by the Library of Congress and the National Archives. We'll be examining the underlying causes, the deep divides, the strategic advantages, and the immense challenges of this era. All right, let's just dive right in.
Real quick, here's our roadmap for this worked practice. First, a nation divided. Second, the chain of escalating events. Third, an evidence comparison of the advantages. Fourth, a misconception check. Fifth, a student check. And finally, number 6, the war and Reconstruction. This way, you'll know exactly when to kick back and listen, and when it's your turn to actively analyze the evidence.
Okay, Section 1, A Nation Divided, the North and South Diverge.
By 1861, the United States was literally facing its absolute greatest crisis to date. The Library of Congress notes that the northern and southern states had been growing further and further apart. We're talking socially, economically, and politically. The source evidence tells us the North was becoming increasingly industrial and commercial. But more importantly, Northerners generally wanted to limit the spread of African American slavery, and some absolutely wanted to abolish it completely. Now, in stark contrast, the South remained largely agricultural. Their entire economy was heavily tied to their desire to maintain and even expand the institution of slavery. So the crucial takeaway here is that these differences weren't just background noise, right? Slavery became the absolute focal point of this political crisis, pulling the two halves of the country in completely opposite directions.
Moving right along to Section 2, Chain of Escalating Events, the Road to War. So how do all these underlying tensions actually explode into a war? Well, the Library of Congress maps out this incredibly rapid, decade-long domino effect during the 1850s that brought the nation right to the brink of destruction. In 1850, a new fugitive slave law provoked national controversy, mostly because a lot of Northerners flat out refused to enforce it. Then, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up new territories to the slavery debate, which led to some really violent clashes. By 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision ruled that no one of African descent could qualify for U.S. citizenship, a ruling that completely outraged abolitionists. In 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led a failed raid on Harper's Ferry to start a slave revolt. So by the time Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the tension had totally snapped. Southern states began seceding, they eventually formed the Confederacy, and in April 1861, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. The war had officially begun.
Section 3, Evidence Comparison, the Advantages. Let's analyze some National Archives data.
All right, it is time to shift gears into practice mode. Systematically comparing evidence from the National Archives, we can clearly see the North held some incredible material advantages. They had a larger population for manpower, substantial factories to pump out war materials, a vast transportation network of railroads and canals, a dominant navy, and they were officially recognized by the world as a legitimate government. On the flip side, the Southern advantages were largely strategic. They were fighting on their own home terrain, they had a very strong military tradition, and they had some truly great commanders like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. But honestly, the most fascinating piece of evidence here, the National Archives notes the South could win the war simply by continuing to exist after hostilities ended. They didn't have to conquer the North, they literally just had to survive.
Section 4, Misconception Check, Southern Motivations. Time for busting myths with evidence.
A huge part of studying history is busting myths using actual source texts. So consider the super common assumption. Did only those who owned slaves support the Southern cause and oppose the North? Take a deliberate beat here. Really think about what the evidence from our text might say about this. Well, let's look at the exact text from the Library of Congress overview. It states perfectly clearly, even Southerners who owned no slaves opposed threatened federal coercion. This is brilliant because it illustrates exactly why we always have to check the source. History is complex. While maintaining slavery was absolutely the focal point of the political crisis and the Confederacy's main goal, the source shows us that opposition to the North and to federal force extended even to Southerners who did not personally own slaves. This right here is exactly how we use evidence to capture the full, complicated picture of the past.
Okay, Section 5, Student Check, Northern Goals. Let's test your understanding.
All right, it's time for a student check. We know the South just had to survive, right? Which placed the burden of winning entirely on the North.
So, based strictly on the National Archives text we're working with today, what 4 specific goals did the North have to achieve to actually defeat the South? I'm going to give you a moment to formulate your answers. Remember, think about the North's advantages and how they would need to apply them to break the South's resistance. Let's see how you did. According to the National Archives, the North had to systematically execute these 4 steps. First, secure control of the Mississippi River so Western goods could move freely. Second, cut off the South from international traders and smugglers who were trying to aid their war effort. Third, completely incapacitate the Confederate Army to stop any northward attacks, like the one that famously happened at Gettysburg. And fourth, curtail the South's ability to produce goods and war materials. Basically, the North had to use its massive industrial and naval advantages to slowly squeeze and dismantle the South's ability to even fight.
And finally, Section 6, the War and Reconstruction, the Aftermath.
So, what was the actual result of all these military strategies colliding? Let's conclude our narrative arc by looking at the outcome of this devastating 4-year conflict and the massive, deeply complicated challenges that followed right in its wake. The Library of Congress materials provide a pretty stark summary of the aftermath. After 4 brutally costly years of fighting, the Union was indeed restored, but it was done through force of arms. Because the vast majority of the war was fought on Southern soil, the South was left physically and economically devastated. The conflict cast a really long shadow. The nation now faced monumental problems. They had to take on the massive challenge of helping newly freedmen and the incredibly difficult task of creating Southern state governments that were actually loyal to the Union. That was a problem that took years during the Reconstruction era to fully resolve.
Which leaves us with this final, profoundly difficult question to think about. How does a devastated nation heal the deep wounds of such a costly and destructive civil war? We've seen the evidence of the deep divides, the escalating tensions, and the brutal strategies that tore the country apart. The Union was saved, but as the sources tell us, the problems of reconstructing the Union were just as difficult as fighting the war itself. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today, and for doing the hard work of investigating our history through the actual evidence. Keep analyzing those sources, and I'll see you next time.